All right, welcome to the Odum Systems Ecology Legacy Podcast. I'm Dave Tilley here with my co-host and today my interviewee, Dr. Mark Brown. Really excited to talk to Mark and to hear all of his stories about the University of Florida, Center for Wetlands, HT Odum. The list is very long, but I thought I'd start with a little introduction for those of you who may not know Dr. Brown. Mark Brown is a professor emeritus of environmental engineering sciences at the University of Florida and served as the director of the Howard T. Odum Center for Wetlands and the Center for Environmental Policy. He's a systems ecologist. His research encompasses wetland ecology, ecological engineering, ecological economics, energy analysis, probably a few other things in there as well, some architecture. Dr. Brown likely had the closest and most enduring association with Dr. Odum of any scientist, with maybe the exception of Betty Odum, is Dr. Odom's late wife. But there's probably a good competition there. Maybe there's some stories to be heard there. I know that Mark first met Dr. Odum in the late 1960s when he was a student. So looking forward to hearing more about that. He worked on countless projects and traveled the world with Dr. Odum over a 30 plus year career. And we can't wait to hear more about his trips and interactions with Dr. Odum. So let's dive in. And I know this is long overdue, so I'm looking forward to getting this recorded. Welcome.
Well, it's a real thrill to be here. It took us a while to get this figured out and get it organized, I guess.
I've been hearing good things about our podcast from other folks, so people are enjoying it. Yeah, so this is it's a very useful exercise, and I'm glad we decided to do it. I've been having a lot of fun with it and look forward to future ones as well. So let's we often start with the podcast with asking about how our guest this time, how you met or heard of Dr. Odum for the first time, and there could be two different stories there. So maybe just start there. How did you come about stumbling into Dr. Odum?
Yeah, so I was in architecture school at the time. I was finishing up my bachelor's degree. At that time, the bachelor's was a 5-year program. And I think I was either in my 5th year or just finishing my 4th and starting my 5th year. I'm not sure. Things get foggy when you go back that far. Anyway, somebody came into my office and said, "You'll never guess who University of Florida had hired." And I said, "Who?" And they said, "Howard T. Odum." And I said, "Who's that?" I'd never heard of him. And during your 5th year and in architecture at that time, you could take courses all over campus because they only had a few courses. One was just a major project course and the other stuff. So I had been taking courses all over the place. And one of the courses was in geography. And it was, I think it was titled Geography Systems or something like that. Josh Dickinson III taught it, and he was a really interesting guy. He was really, big scale thinker, really thinking really large. And I think it was in that class when Odum came and gave a lecture like he did. Like I learned he did everywhere. Whenever he started someplace or came to someplace new, the first thing he wanted to do was to give a lecture, invite the entire university come and hear what he had to say. And so he was given this lecture, and I started to just be totally blown away by the unconventional way that he lectured. It wasn't linear at all. It was all over the place, but it somehow resonated with me. And because I was in architecture, I was really interested in cities. I thought cities were horrible places. And then that's what needed to be done. Buildings are one thing, but the city seemed to me to be the thing. So I had spent the last couple of years of architecture school reading anything I could about cities. And so I had all of this stuff kind of rattling around inside my brain, cities, transportation and healthcare and all kinds of things, that make up a city and the people and whatnot. And he got to the place in this lecture, which he often did, where he was talking about the systems language. And he said, so to demonstrate, I'll draw a diagram. Does anybody have a system that they wanted? And I raised my hand and I said, a city. And so he started drawing a diagram. And, the first thing you do is, well, what are the components? We listed those, and what's driving, what are the drivers? And we listed those. And then he started drawing this diagram of the city, and it was like an epiphany. I mean, it was an unbelievable experience. Still makes me hair kind of tickle on the back of my neck. It was like, oh, wow. After all of that reading and after all that thinking about cities, there it is. It's right in front of me, and you can sort of see if you pushed on that, how it would affect the rest of the city because of all the lines and things that were connecting it. So I was sold. And then somebody, either he gave me or somebody gave me his Environment, Power, and Society. And that was the second epiphany, the second thing. It just blew me away. And it sort of became the touchstone for my final project in architecture, my 5th-year project. It was the thing that kind of I finally coalesced around and was able to do. So it was just, he got hired at the University of Florida, and I happened to be here, and somehow maybe I was somewhat receptive to, to the way he taught and what he was saying, and I think the other thing that really kind of blew me away was I finally saw the purpose for the chemistry and the physics and the calculus and the differential equations I had taken as in school, because it all started to fit. Up until that time, they were all kind of separate courses, and it was like, whoa, now I understand what it all means. Anyway.
Yeah, I think you can really see the overlap across the different sciences when you see those diagrams, and you realize that language is common. You can tell a common story across all these fields. That's really incredible. So let's dive a little deeper on the project. I haven't heard this story before. So you're a 5th-year student, and you decided to work on cities and systems. Were you like drawing systems diagrams? Was Odum involved at all, or were you able to get his ear to kind of advance your ideas?
Yeah. So this is where it gets a little foggy for me. Just in terms of time. I finished my bachelor's degree in 1971. And if I'm not mistaken, he came to UF in 1970, either at the end of the school year of 1970, or it's right in there somewhere. And so I do remember that I was working on my final project, the 5th-year project, when I heard that lecture. And I think I finished it up, and then I started a master's degree. Or it could have been that I was already working on my master's. I don't know.
It is 55 years ago. Yeah, a long time.
I mean, it's a long time. And it's, anyway, yes, to answer your question, I think it was probably, I was just finishing up my 5th-year project, and then I started my master's, and that was, a 2-year project all along. And I worked on it, reading Environment, Power, and Society, drawing diagrams, and created a plan for Lee County in Florida on how to develop the county as a whole, based on McCargish, Ian McCarg's concepts of design with nature, by that time I was into computers, and we were programming computer maps and overlaying them to determine where things should go, and where not to do development and so forth. And it became a really interesting project for Lee County because they didn't even have a planning department. I mean, that's how,
Wow.
it goes way back. They had a guy who uh, put the names on roads. That was about the planning. Somebody brought in a development, and he would put names on the roads. So a lot of them had his daughter's names and things. I
Yeah, a lot of
remember
prerogative.
meeting him, and so we went down, and I made a presentation to the city commission on this project. And the first thing I said is that there's all this undevelopable land out there. It's the eastern part of your county is all wetlands. There's hardly any developable land out there. Well, they totally freaked out. They said, "Well, that doesn't make any difference." You got to think back in the early 1970s, there were no wetland laws. There was no, everything was fair game. You could develop anything in Florida. And I was real heady at the time. I was what, 21 years old or 22 years old. Who knows? I thought I knew everything. So I'm telling
Mhm.
these people what's going on. And I remember one of the city commissioners turned to me and he says, "Son, you're breathing rarefied air up there in that ivory tower. That ain't how it is down here." Oh, okay. So anyway, that he would HT would come by from time to time, or I would go see him from time to time and talk a little bit about the project. And it's mostly about my diagrams and stuff like that. One of the things I think that he picked up from us over in architecture um, was we had a studio. There was a group of us, and we were called the Southwest Florida Planning Team, SWFPT, SWIFT. Southwest Florida Planning Team, yeah. And we had a little bit of money from Lee County, and we all had this big space, and it was our space on this group. Grant Genova, Linda Searle, Richard Moore, um, oh boy, forgetting names. I'll think of them, but and we were all
Was
architecture students, and we were all doing some aspect of planning and so forth in Southwest Florida. And he really liked this concept of having all the students in one place. There was a big table in the middle of the room, and I think he took that back to Black Hall.
yeah.
And he had one big room. All of his students were in this giant room with a big table in the middle. And as you well know, that
Yeah.
table was famous, and it followed him for the rest of his life. But
Yeah, that survived into the 90s when I was there for sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, so you must have had some, you were influencing him even at that point on the architecture. And I assume that maybe your professor, I don't know who was involved with it from the architecture side, but what was he thinking about Ian McHarg's ideas, for example, or just kind of where architecture was? And he probably thought quite a bit about landscapes. And you saw that in Environment, Power, and Society that he thought about
Right.
landscapes a lot in terms of energetics.
Yeah. So the faculty member who was our mentor in this SWIFT team was Larry Peterson. And he was another iconoclast when it came to the university system or the architecture system. We were reading all kinds of books all over the place. He would bring in a book and say, "You guys have got to read this." And he was really a forward thinker and a peripheral thinker and a systems thinker. And it was the perfect mentor for me in architecture. It gave me latitude to do a lot of things that I might not have been able to do if he hadn't have been there and been a faculty member. And one of them was taking courses all over the place. So it was really, and he interacted with HT, but never never in a way that where he was working on projects with Odum. Um, I think he was, more of an architect than of, a systems ecologist,
Yeah.
but really
Yeah.
certainly had a leaning in that direction. But that was what gave us the latitude to really to do stuff. And then throughout my master's, I became more and more enamored with Odum and what was going on the other side of campus than in the architecture program. And I remember taking his course, and it was intimidating at one level, because I had never had that kind of science before, that kind of stuff. And they were talking, I'll never forget that one day that somebody said, and the phytoplankton, and I was freaked out. It was like the first day of class or the second day of class, and they were using terms that I had never heard. Phytoplankton. What the hell is phytoplankton?
Yeah.
Then I realized, which we need to talk about too, which is go back even further and how I wound up, even in
Yeah. Yeah.
architecture. But I realized that I had been playing with everything that these people were trying to put numbers on, and they were trying to, understand how they worked. And ever since I was a kid, I was in under on the water or in the woods in South Florida, experiencing and observing and looking at it and how it worked. Um, I, so once
That's
I
what I
got
wanted to hear
past the
more about, was
vocab,
like how you got from
yeah,
South Florida, where you grew up, to architecture. And
once I got past the vocabulary, then it was really easy for me because I had already experienced all of these ecosystems, from a hands-on thing. So, all right, so I'll go back. Um, I grew up in Miami, um, and until I was 6, and then we moved up to Pompano, which is 60 miles more or less north of Miami. And we had a house, the first house in a development, on the Intercoastal Waterway, right next to the Hillsborough Inlet. And I, for many reasons, spent the vast majority of my time outside. We didn't have a television, so there was no need to be inside for that. My parents didn't get along too well, so I didn't want to be around around them. So I spent most of the time, and sometimes I'd come home on Friday from school and I would pack a lunch, some food, and I would take off for the weekend, and I wouldn't come home until I had to be home for church on Sunday mornings. But so I would be out exploring, fishing, diving, um, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. And that was my childhood. And I dove on some of the most beautiful reefs. Now that I look back, and now that I've seen other reefs, I mean, the reefs off of Pompano were incredible. They were brain corals, the size of a bedroom almost, uh, 3 or 4 meters in diameter, huge brain
wow.
corals and sea fans and unbelievable variety of fish. And every once in a while, a shark, which would scare the hell out of us. But amazing stuff. And it's all gone now. It's unfortunate that.
So you're out there playing around on in the reefs, and swimming and fishing and tromping
Yeah,
through the swamps and
yeah.
forests.
And
Um,
so in my senior year, first of all, I figured out how to skip school in my junior year and not get caught. And so I stopped going to school. And except when I ran out, you were allowed to miss, I forget now what it was, 60 days out of a year or something. And I was counting. And once I got close to that, then I had to go to school. So I wound up,
that's a lot of days.
I know. Anyway, but my cousin, and my father, to a certain extent, were contractors. My cousin was a contractor. My father worked with him and for him. and he got a big job down in the islands in St. Kitts. It's right at the cusp of the Windward and Leeward Islands. And since there were no building codes to amount to anything, and I had been taking a drafting course, an architectural drafting course in high school, he said, "Hey, Mark, would you draw up plans for me?" And he would sort of sketch out what he wanted for these little bungalows and for the main building and everything else. And I started drawing plans. And then he would take them down to St. Kitts, and they would, say, "Okay, build it." And he was building houses from plans from a high school student in Florida.
Wow.
But that sort of got me interested in architecture. And my good friend through high school and through college and up until recently, Grant Genova, he passed away about a year ago or so. He wanted to go to college, and he said, "Why don't we?" Because he thought maybe I would do it. He said, let's go study architecture," because I didn't know what I was going to do. I was, I thought I didn't like school. And so I wasn't sure. And so he said, "Well, let's go to school and study architecture." I said, "Okay, why not?" So we did 2 years at the junior college in Broward County, and then came up to the University of Florida. And so I was in architecture, and I was going to be an architect until I met H.T. Odum, and then it was like a right angle, a right turn.
Yeah.
I really changed.
But you really grew up, sounds like, kind of like a naturalist, being outside
Yeah.
and really appreciating that aspect. And would you like formally? You probably weren't. Were you formally thinking about systems in any way? You think at that point, or there probably wasn't much
Well,
influence from an academic standpoint.
I understood connections. We lived right next to the Hillsborough Inlet, and so when there was certain kinds of weather, the sargassum from the Sargasso Sea would flow into the inlet and come flowing up the intercoastal waterway, and we'd get out there with nets and net this sargassum, and there were incredible animals that lived in the sargassum. These fish that looked just like sargassum seaweed, but they were fish, and little seahorses, and all kinds of animals. And so I always had an aquarium that was stocked with stuff from sargassum, from the Sargasso Sea. So there were things like that I understood that there was a connection between something small scale as these little fish and the giant storms that were blowing and turning everything around out there and pushing it all into the coast.
Yeah.
And then the seasonality that when the shrimp would run, and it was only at a certain time when things were the currents were right and the temperatures were right and everything else, and we would get this influx of shrimp coming in up the canal, and we would get a year's worth of shrimp in an evening, just sitting out there as fast as you could do this.
Yeah.
They're all gone too.
We'll get into pulsing systems later, but really getting in tune with the pulse is the key aspect of systems ecology. That's great. So let's go forward a little bit more. And so you've we'll go back to your time at Florida in Gainesville, early years there. You're finishing up your master's in architecture, and the Center for Wetlands has started. Dr. Odum has gotten his large grant from Rockefeller and from I guess National Science Foundation maybe had contributed some as well. Double funding there. And you start working on projects, I guess, maybe for your PhD, or what's the transition there from your architecture master's to?
Yeah, so I finished my master's in '73, and I was looking at sort of applying a McHarg thing using computers, and I got really interested in again, overlaying and trying to understand where things should go and so forth. But and I finished my master's. I didn't know what I was going to do. In the meantime, since I had been hanging around over there so much, Odum got this grant from the Defense Department on Vietnam, and
Mm,
it was supposed to be studying the effect of herbicides on mangroves, because of herbiciding, uh, one application quite frequently of Agent Orange would kill the mangroves, and
mm.
not just defoliate them, but actually kill them. And so the Defense Department, I don't know who talked them into saying, "Oh, gee, what's going on here?" But anyway, and they gave some money to a couple of different places, and some of it came to HT. And I don't know the background there. How come he wound up with some? But so it was the I think it was called the Herbicides and Mangroves in South Vietnam. I don't remember.
Mm.
Anyway, he offered me a little stipend, not much, a little bit of money to work on it. And by that time, I had become somewhat accomplished with the analog computers. And so I started working on it, and my job was model the war and the
No small
effect
task.
and the effect of the war on Vietnam. And so I was diving into all of the data I could find about how many bombs and how many personnel, and how trying to quantify the disordering energy that went into Vietnam, and then also trying to quantify what was the damage, what areas were being affected, and of course Agent Orange was one of them as well. And I had gotten the model running, and it was still, unless you've used an analog computer, big one with all of the wires and everything else, and the numbers of potentiometers and so forth, they're incredibly frustrating, because a potentiometer could blow and you didn't know it, and you'd be in there readjusting all your dials, and then somebody'd come in and go, "Oh, by the way, Maury Cell blew pot number 5 last night," just in case. And here I'd spent 5 hours tuning my model when one of the potentiometers was bad. The potentiometers are like the coefficients on a flow. You turn them, you increase the coefficient or decrease the coefficient.
Uh-huh.
So I was working on that, and then I started reading all this stuff about Vietnam, and it began to really, really bother me. I just, oh man, like still to this day, I remember. And I finally, I just got really, really depressed, and I quit. I just
Mm,
stopped coming to the workshop. And I had been back when I was in architecture school, and I get so there was 2 years between my master's and when I started the PhD. So this is kind of happening during that 2 years. So he just hired me as
mm,
occasional. I wasn't a student in either place at the time, and I was doing some teaching in architecture during that time as well. Anyway, I got really depressed, and I had been working at the craft center teaching people how to ceramics, and so I just went over there and started throwing pots. I was just freaking out. It was,
Not potentiometers, actual ceramics.
yeah, yeah, right. And I don't know how much time transpired again. It's been too long, but all of a sudden, um, one evening, I'm in there throwing pots, and Odum shows up, and um, he really laid. He wasn't gentle at all, which he really laid into me, and started off by saying, that's really, you didn't even tell me you were leaving. You just left, and la la la, and it ended with, society has invested an awful lot in you, and you're just wasting it away, and you need to come back.
Not maximizing your power.
Right. And that kind of shook me, and I said, well, I mean, if he come and get me, I guess I ought to go back. I felt bad
Yeah.
about it in a little bit, but also, it was very special. So I went back and continued working on that project. And then I
I mean, it
think,
must be really like tumultuous times though, because I mean, this is the height of the Vietnam War, right? Like it's really getting
yeah,
escalated, and
yeah, it
there were
was
a lot
just,
of
yeah. When did we pull out? Was it 70?
74, I think was one of the
Yeah, so
final,
this was
right?
this was probably
70,
73.
yeah.
The cusp right before we pulled it.
Uh-huh.
I had
Well,
been
I
reading
think
about
just
all of it.
um I remember when I first met you, you gave me a copy of your Vietnam War paper that you had written. And of course, I wanted to learn about ecology, and this guy gives me his model of war, and I'm like, wow. I'm like, but I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand the diagrams, the symbols, but I
Yeah.
was really fascinated that you could model war, with a computer and these diagrams. I just remember that making such an impression. Of course, that's like
Yeah.
that's 30 years later or 20 years, yeah, 20 years later, right? 94. So, uh,
So my model predicted that when we pulled out, when aid stopped and we pulled out, that Vietnam would collapse because the amount of aid and everything else we were pumping into the country was what is holding it up. And sure enough,
yeah,
we pulled out, and 10 days later almost, it
that's right.
literally imploded. But that paper got published as a chapter in a book by Charlie Hall and John Day, on modeling or something. And
But I think we touched on this in other podcasts with some of the other folks about how Odum would always push, I guess, kind of the boundaries of the deliverables and the scope of a
yeah,
project. So the scope was nothing to do with modeling the war. I'm guessing the scope was what's going on with those mangroves and what's going to happen and what can we do to ameliorate the problem. And he
exactly.
has this idea. I don't know if there's a conversation about that. It sounds like maybe he just came to you with the idea, or I don't know how that kind of interaction
I
worked.
don't remember now how. I think he, you know, that's what money he had, and he just kind of dangled it out there and said, would you like to work on this project? And I don't know that he said, I want you to model war. I think that was my idea. I thought, well, there's all of
Oh,
this disordering going on. I was really into order disorder. And that was because of one statement he made. He had a graduate student, I think it was Jeffrey Ritchie, before he came to Florida. And Jeffrey Ritchie was making microcosms and then blowing them up with firecrackers and stuff and measuring the disorder and the order. And that just really, wow, I thought that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. And I sort of became enamored with this idea of order disorder and the balance of ordering and disordering. And so that
yeah,
evolved into, I think it evolved into the modeling of the war. But
some real ecological principles to test out there.
yeah.
Uh,
And since that time, I still think about blowing up microcosms.
yeah, I mean that had an influence on me because I remember when I started teaching here at Maryland, that was one of the first things I did in class was have them develop a microcosm, but we had to come up with some kinds of ways of disturb them. So we'd
Yeah,
have blow torches for fire and
right.
floods, and you see what happens.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a lot of
so
fun.
your influence, lives lived on
But
quite a
you're right
while.
about the he always gave way more than the deliverables that were supposed to be there. All he was really supposed to do was to sort of test the effect of Agent Orange on mangroves. Well, you can't go around spraying herbicides in mangroves in Florida, so they had to do it surreptitiously. And I suppose we're past the 7 years of
The statute of limitation.
statute of limitations. Yeah, but Maurice Sell was down in Marco Island spraying mangroves with Agent Orange to see the impact of it.
So that was in probably his thesis or dissertation, then I guess.
That was part of his dissertation. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so it lived on. Did Odom go over to Vietnam? He probably didn't have to go to Vietnam for the project, did he?
I think he was supposed to go, and I think there was a major um, offensive.
Oh, yeah,
They canceled
okay,
all travel to go there. I think that's what happened.
right, right. Um, so let's so that's just the beginning of many, many projects
Yeah.
and collaborations that
Now, I
you
think
had
the
with
next
him.
project was the South Florida project, and that was a project that was the result of who I wonder. Let's just say it was Dade County decided to build a jet port out in the middle of the Everglades, a major jet port, because their airport there in Miami was sort of landlocked. I mean,
Hmm.
development happening all around it, and it was really impossible to make it larger. And they were thinking transcontinental big jets that went faster than the speed of sound. You know, back in those days, we're going big, man. So they put down this runway out in the middle of the Everglades, and it was being used at the time for pilots to do touch and goes with these giant air jets, passenger jets. And there was an uproar from the environmental community, and they were able to stop it. But prior to stopping it, they got the U.S. Department of the Interior to fund a whole bunch of studies, many different studies on the impact of a jet port on the Miccosukee Indian tribe, on the hydrology of the Everglades, on the bird, the Everglades, all the different organisms, and they studied everything. They put a bunch of money out there, a bunch of individual guys, and then they had all this, and they still didn't know whether or not we should do the airport or not. And somebody, and I think it may have been, forgot his name now, the Undersecretary of the Interior. He lived in um, Fort Pierce area, I think maybe. Anyway, I think it was him who said, "Well, we have to get somebody who puts stuff together, who understands big picture," and that's H.T. Odum at the University of Florida. So Odum got, I remember exactly, it was $150,000. This is 1972,
Hmm.
maybe. Um, so that was big bucks back then.
Yeah, at least a factor of 10 to today's money, if not more, I'm guessing.
Yeah, probably. Um, and the university overhead was much smaller back then. The majority of the money went to students. So that
Amazing.
employed an incredible number of students, and I was one of them. I still wasn't a PhD student. I was still in this between
Yeah,
years,
yeah.
I guess. And it was to try and study the effect, the possible effects of this big development. Well, Odum titled it "Carrying Capacity for Man and Nature in South Florida." Slightly different than, but he wanted to look at the much bigger scale, not just the jet port and its effects, but the effects of, you know, and at the time, carrying capacity was a buzzword. There were people that were actually
Hmm.
talking about carrying capacity. It's hard to find it now. It's
That's
disappeared.
coming out of the population dynamics communities, I guess, right? Like,
Yeah.
I always forget the Stanford guy.
Mm.
Should be prepared for these names.
I know. So, God, there was a bunch of us. Me, Bob Costanza, Ed de Bellevue. Um, mm, who else was supported on it? Kemp was on it for a while.
Boynton was Walter on it. Walter Boynton.
Walter might have been on it for a while. Uh,
Uh-huh.
Anybody that was kind of around.
Yeah, because that was like the one of the main projects after the wetlands projects. I'm guessing, like one of the big ones, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I haven't even mentioned the wetlands project that started and started the Center for Wetlands, and that was in 1971
Hmm.
uh, when it started, and it was heavy on. I mean, that was a 5-year project. And we're talking 1972 when the South Florida project started. And so we had a whole passel of students on that project. So at the time, he probably had 10 or 15 graduate students working on all of these various aspects of everything. And I could see it was taking a toll on him. He never slept. And I asked him one time about, how do you ever sleep? He says, no. I said, well, how's that possible? He says, I replace sleep with food. And he really believed it. He thought that if he ate more,
Yeah.
the system would
Just as an aside, I remember he and I went down to South Florida one time, and we were going to drive down, and I picked him up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we're headed down to Martin County, or right, St. Lucie, Martin County, right? And he gets in the car and he brings his pillow. He's like, "Well, I've been up all night." He's like, "I want to take a nap while you drive." And
Yeah.
he slept for like the first 2 hours of the trip. So I think that's another way he caught up.
Yeah. So there was so much going on. That's when the seminars, Wednesday afternoon, noonday wetland seminar started, was in 1971.
Uh-huh.
It happened in our studio. I was in Phelps Lab in the big room in Phelps Lab. So students all had desks around the outside, and there was a table in the middle, and we kind of pushed the table to one side, and there was a blackboard and a screen, and put up chairs, and that was the seminar. The student studio space doubled as a seminar space.
Yeah.
And then there were Thursday afternoon seminars, which we'll get to in a moment. I'll come back to those because that's
I'm gonna pause. Can we pause for 1 second?
Sure.
I'm at home and my dogs are annoying me, so they want to go in and out. And
here we go. All right, we're back. So we were talking about South Florida project, yeah. And so once again, Odum does 10 times what anybody wants him to do, or what they had agreed to do. And there were people studying developments in Collier County, on the impact of developments on a river there. I was looking at that time, looking at carrying capacity in Lee County, and Ed de Bellevue was looking at Hendry County, and somebody else was looking at Collier County, and we were developing models or diagrams and carrying capacity calculations for all of those, and then the large scale, the entire Everglades or the entire South Florida project. And we decided to draw these land use land cover maps for the entire watershed of the South Florida, which includes the Kissimmee River, comes down from Orlando, spreads out, and includes the entire southern portion of Florida. And of course, there's no digital computers, none of that. We had aerial photographs that were brand new. They were 9x9s, and they were they were black and white, infrared, so you could see vegetation really well. And I hired a bunch of undergraduate geography students, because they were, they're into maps, geographers are into maps.
Sure.
And we started interpreting all of these aerial photographs with ink pens with a piece of acetate on top of the photograph, and outlining all of the different ecosystem types, and putting a number in it depending upon what ecosystem, from a key. And then the best part of the whole project was I had to hire an airplane with a pilot and fly over all of this to ground truth it, because you couldn't go on the ground. There's just no way. We're talking, millions of hectares of land, and no access. So we had to fly it. So I would hold a whole stack of photos. They were flown in order. So there's, each one was right next to the other. And I'd hold all of these photos on my lap with the interpretation, on top of it. And we would fly up one side of the photograph and then turn around and fly back the other side of the photograph. And I'm taking notes about what's right and what's wrong. And my pilot was a faculty member over in the in engineering anyway. And he wanted to get hours because he was trying to qualify for a bigger license, pilot's licenses. So he was happy to fly me. Didn't have to pay
Nice.
for that. All I had to do is pay for the plane. And he was really happy because he was getting a free plane and all those hours. And his name was Chet Kilstra. So anyhow, I spent days and days and days flying all over Florida, ground truthing these things. Then we would take them back, and then I had another geography student who would draw those onto a base map and of the entire South Florida region with the roads on it and certain cultural features. And then we had to paint it because again, there's no computers, there's no ARC info or ARC map or anything like that. This is all done by hand. And at that point, HT asked me to hire his daughter, Mary, for to do the painting because she was artistic. He said, you could, and it would be good for her. She was having some rough spot in her life, and so I hired her. And how we painted these things was with a hypodermic needle, because they're really tiny little things on this Mylar. And we had to flip the Mylar over to the back side and paint from the back side. So the front side was good and clean and looked great. And we finally learned that we had to cut the tip off the hypodermic needle. Otherwise people were tattooing themselves with these.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I had to hire Joy Bartholomew to mix up the colors because we needed, I think it was something like 9 different greens for the ecosystems, and 3 or 4 different blues for water, and then a whole bunch of oranges and yellows and for agriculture, and then purples and reds for urban. And anyway, so they're out there painting like crazy. And I remember Mary, they would get clogged, and you had to kind of clean them out. Well, she would just push like mad, and all of a sudden, so the room had these splotches of paint here and there where somebody would hit it. But HT really appreciated those maps. He thought they were really they were beautiful. They're still hanging on the wall.
I say they're still hanging in the Center for Wetlands on the main corridor. And the colors have withstood the test of time. It looks like
there was a leak in the roof, and one of them got wet, which is a shame. But the others are still there.
Phenomenal. So, what was kind of the carrying capacity? So did you get to an answer on the carrying capacity, or what the role that?
Well, so you may recall that there was this concept, or is this concept, that there's a developed carrying capacity, which is what is the ratio of non-renewable to renewable in the larger system. So you're embedded in a system. Every system is always embedded in another system, right? And so the South Florida region is embedded in the Florida region, which is embedded in the US. So when you look at the ratio of non-renewable to renewable, it's about 8-to-1 in the United States, and more or less the same in the entire state of Florida. So the idea then was, well, then you don't want to be more than that because you may not be competitive, and you don't want to be less than that because you may not be competitive. You want to be at that same level, all right? And so that's where that whole idea came to fruition, was during the South Florida project, when we were trying to come up with a a method for saying, well, what is the carrying capacity? You think about it, it's relative. It's not a fixed number. You know.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of getting into like, the origins of emergy, because at this point, emergy doesn't exist as a term. The concepts of energy
Quality does.
flows, yeah, the quantities, right? And the quality ideas are there, right?
Yeah, and we were using fossil fuel work equivalents instead of solar M joules. They were
Yeah, the predecessor.
FFWEs, FWEs, fossil fuel work equivalents. And the idea was, but it's the same principle. And this idea that energy has quality and that you can figure out its quality based on how much it takes to make it. Now, a little aside at this point, I think will work. We had
This is not a linear conversation, so don't worry.
right. The only thing, I'm not even sure even time is linear, to be honest with you. So we were having always, ever since I can remember, HT had Thursday afternoon seminar, and it was almost always at 4:05 p.m., which was the time when that period started. And it was usually down in Black Hall. And I remember this particular evening, and it was late by the time we left. It was dark outside because they would go, 4 or 5. I mean, it might go to 6:30. Nobody left. Some didn't leave out of fear. Others didn't leave because it was just too damn exciting. It was, and this particular evening, Odum was holding forth on this idea of quality and a quantitative method for determining the different qualities. And he had done stuff on the board, and basically it was how much it took of one form of energy to make another one, and that's the quality factor.
Yeah.
Which we now call transformity or unit energy value or whatever. And I remember after he talked about it, and we got up to leave, and we were kind of all shuffling out, and Walter Boynton turns to me and says, "Did you understand that?" And I said, "Yeah, I understand it really well." He said, "I don't think I did." And it was that particular evening was the beginning of quantitative. I mean, he had been talking about energy quality all the way back in Environment, Power, and Society, even before that. But this was now getting more quantitative. He'd sort of come up with a way of doing it. So.
Yeah, so that must have really come out. So in the South Florida project, you're looking at all these like the natural landscape, the uses and the flows there, but you're also contrasting that with what's going on in the cities and the urban areas.
Yeah.
So you come up with quality factors and transformities, I guess, for these different kind of land uses, land covers.
Yeah. Yeah, and we had the different, going back to the greens and the oranges and the reds on the maps. The darker the green on the map, the more productive was the ecosystem, and the darker the yellow or brown, the more productive, the more energy at that time energy required to run it. So we had realized that you could use the coloring as a way of demonstrating visually the more productive and less productive of all the systems.
So you guys must have, were you like going to town with like calculating these transformities you didn't have the word transformity yet, but
yeah,
just thinking about it and the thoughts that you could be able to imagine by having a metric.
There's no computers. So we're using calculators.
Yeah.
There were calculators. And I remember,
and the calculators weren't scientific, right? They're just basically doing multiplication and division, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know when the scientific ones came in, but yeah, there was lots of zeros.
Yeah, I'd say the orders of magnitude are an issue.
Yeah. The first computers really were when I was working on my PhD. you know, so I started my PhD in 75, and the South Florida project, I think, was still going on at that time, or getting close to ending, because the date of the report is 1976. So I think probably the South Florida project kind of ended, and then he and I pulled together all the bits and pieces and tried to put it into a report. And
Is that where the idea too? I mean, I remember this is a conversation I heard him talk about occasionally was that Miami emerges as this international city and really kind of the hub of Latin America in some
yeah,
ways. I don't know if that's was a product of the South Florida project or not, but
it
maybe that's
was. And
something.
Jim Zucchetto was the one that did the study of Miami and Dade County. That was his dissertation. Yeah.
Nice. All right, so you move on to PhD. So that's, yeah, what was your PhD? What was the? I forget the title of your PhD. Energy
Uh,
basis of.
energy basis for let's see, energy basis of an energy basis for hierarchies in urban and regional systems.
So then South Florida project forms something of the basis, right, of your.
Yeah, I used a lot of data from the South Florida project. And by that time, well, almost everything that came out for a period of time, because Odum was writing Energy Basis for Man and Nature, the book, and so
Yeah,
everything was energy basis for
sure, sure.
or something. And so that was the dissertation. But and I don't think I worked on anything else. I mean, there was South Florida project, and then I was just kind of working on my own. I didn't have funding um,
But
from
you
the.
did some simulation modeling, right?
I
What was that
did.
part? But now, so you're transitioning from away from the analogs to digital at this point, or does that come later?
No, this was the transition. It was
Mm.
during my dissertation that, first of all, um, he made everyone do both. So I think you can ask Walter, and I don't remember what year Walter finished, but I think he finished a little bit before I did. And the idea was you had to do both an analog and a digital. He didn't fully trust the digital yet. He was still
Yeah.
of the analog mindset, but mine was completely digital. Although I had to have an analog diagram. That was,
But no actual analog simulation.
no analog simulation, but a
All
diagram.
right.
And that was when I was doing the simulations for my dissertation. They had just started allowing people to um, send your program in via, I think it was called TPC.
Mm.
You could type it into the computer from a
Hmm.
terminal protocol, something like that.
Right.
So I was submitting my simulation models, but they had a very interesting cost structure. If you submitted something to run on the computer during the day when it was heavily used, the cost per
Mm.
millisecond or whatever was very, very high. But if you submitted it and said run it overnight at the lowest demand time, then it was pennies. It didn't it cost very much at
All
all.
right.
I had maybe $30. I don't know how much money I had for simulation. So I would submit my model to run at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon to run at night. And I
Hmm.
would then be able to pick it up in the morning. And then I would go home and I would work on writing the dissertation until about 1 or 2 in the morning, and then drink a glass of wine to go to sleep. And I would sleep until 11. And I would get up, go in, get the results from the simulation, and go, oh, I forgot to dot an I, or I
Oh,
forgot to do this,
yeah.
resubmit it again. And so every submission was a day. And so you can
Yeah.
imagine how many simulations I couldn't do because there weren't enough days in the year. many years later, when I had a computer on my desk, I did all the simulations for my dissertation, which took me months. I did them in an afternoon, once you
Yeah,
have
it's
a computer
incredible the speed with which you can
changed.
just iterate and the feedback you get. Yeah, in the digital. Must have been like that. That made you like think. I don't know. Did you like spend more time thinking about what you're going to put into the model? Obviously, the models are probably you want to hedge your bet and make them a little more simple than you could have later on. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, I was a firm believer in HT's idea of macroscopic mini models. I had the Vietnam model was hugely complex. And to really understand what was happening in a complex model is very difficult. It's not a simple thing. They're somewhat counterintuitive. You think that it's going to behave this way when you do this, and they don't. And you don't know whether that's because of something wrong with the model or with the way you programmed it, or with your thinking. It's just so murky in there.
yeah.
That by the time I did my dissertation, I was doing very, very macroscopic mini models, just testing theory. So, but
I
that
find sometimes you do those complicated models and you get some kind of output and you do some elaborate interpretation of it and make some story about it. Then you realize that that really is just an artifact of
right.
a little parameter. Makes no sense in reality. It's trying too hard to
Yeah.
match your interpretation to the output.
And so during that time, I think HT was gone from time to time on a sabbatical or visiting scholars. And so I was kind of left to my own devices, I guess. And then when he would come back to town, I'd schedule time with him. And he was writing, of course, he was writing the big book, what is it, Systems Ecology. And so he was not on campus. He was working from his little studio behind his house. So twice a week, I would go over there with um, drafts and drop them off, and then come back in a couple of days, and he would have done his thing on them. And this again before computers, so it was all typed, hand typed, and he insisted. So this was an amazing thing. As you're moving along through your dissertation, um, and it's hand typing, you got all of it in a binder. It's in a binder, 3-ring binder, and he wants to see the old page and the revised page, so he can see what he asked to be revised and what you did. And so the binders just start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because you have to keep double pages. And he really insisted, in order for him to not have to completely, he would say, well, if you don't give it back to me, I'm going to re-edit. I might put back in what you just took out. So he was a real stickler for that. And he also was a stickler for of putting it there, having a physical thing, in front of you that you can together, that you can see.
Yeah.
Even when people started doing stuff on the computer, he didn't want it. He didn't want to see a file. He wanted to see the physical thing. No, you don't send me a file, a Word file or something. He wouldn't accept that. He never did.
One the paper copy, the hard copy.
Yeah.
Very tactile. Um, wow. So digital computers, so then you can, I mean, that's just going to continue throughout your career working with digital computers. You really never look back to analog. There's no point, right?
No, I once I hit digital, I said, "Oh, wow, this is wonderful. I'm not going that way."
Well, I mean, I guess this is too like when the Apples and the Macs are going to start coming out, probably about that time or shortly after.
Yeah.
But you could
My
you
first foray into digital was on the big machine on campus, the central machine, and that's where all my simulations were done. But then the next level was um, computers the Zenith of all people were making these computers, and they were running MS-DOS. I didn't know what MS stood for, but DOS was disk operating system. I understood that.
Yeah.
And it was very primitive at that time. There was no GUI, mouse, no nothing. It was all
Yeah.
codes and so forth to make it do what you wanted to do. And then about that time, I decided I was going to build my own computer. And there was this company, Tandy Leather of all companies, that was making computers. And then you could buy the components and put them together yourself. And so I ordered and bought all of these components, and I had to solder all of the chips, everything onto these boards. And I mean, I actually built it from the ground up. I didn't know what the chips did or anything, but I was just following directions. So put this here and solder it here, and it worked. I mean, I used that computer for years and years, and then eventually, and it ran MS-DOS. No, it ran. Oh, that was right. So the Zenith computers were running ZDOS, not MS. And then IBM came out with their, what do they call it? They had a name for it, but this a desktop computer, a mini computer, and they contracted with MS and had an MS-DOS on those. And I used that for a while, and then I flipped over to Mac and never went back. I thought, Mac was, when it first, remember the little square one, the little tiny thing like this?
Yeah.
I didn't like that one, but once they came out with a computer, what I call a real computer,
the whole graphical user interface, the mouse.
But Odum was always right up on technology like that. And even though, like we talked about a moment ago, that he wanted you to do both an analog and a digital. Once he accepted the digital, then he always had the latest digital computer, and switched over and started using BASIC, the language BASIC as a program.
Right. So he adopted that pretty early on and stuck with it. I mean, pretty much through to the end using BASIC. Because the macroscopic mini models were amenable to.
Yeah, it was very easy to program them into BASIC. And then, MS-DOS stopped supporting BASIC, and then they came up with their own BASIC, and then it's gone through many iterations, but it's still the same language, and still the same commands over the years. And a lot of people were always critical of him, saying, well, why don't you use Fortran, or why don't you use COBOL, or these fancy things? And Odum always said, you must keep it simple. You have to keep it simple. You don't want the technology to get in the way of what people, if they have to spend more time trying to understand the technology, then they're missing what the most important part is here, which is the science, that stuff.
Thinking.
So he always.
So ultimately, all the modeling and the basic models and the macroscopic mini models, they show up as Modeling for All Scales, the book that he eventually publishes in like 2000. But I'm assuming these models were being kind of developed even back to the 70s. And what's kind of the trajectory of like the mini models, like their origin and how they're being used? You're probably using them for teaching, I guess, a lot, but the projects and how they kind of turn into a book, I guess.
Yeah. Well, he started out with the simplest ones, of course, exponential growth and like
non-renew
and on and on. Tank, a tank being discharged out and so forth. And but almost weekly or monthly or bi-monthly, he'd come in with another one that he had been programming, and they got more and more complex over time. And so some of the latter models in Modeling for All Scales are fairly complex for basic models. The one on rainforest, Laquillo rainforest, and there's one on the shrimp dynamics in the bay in Puerto Rico. They all get fairly, for a mini model, they're not so macroscopic anymore. You know, you got parts.
Wait, what's neat? Like he works out all these kind of little mechanisms, mathematical relationships. I'm thinking like the renew aspect. It has this flow limited source, and just kind of how that comes about, and
That's an
uh,
interesting one. That goes way back. Martha Gilliland. Some people out there will know that name.
mhm.
She came up with the math for that, and immediately it clicked. It was like, yes, of course. And so then
Oh,
from that day forward, that symbol with the with the R going,
yeah,
stuff that's not the remainder that's not being used. And I remember that when the first time he explained it, it just went right over my head,
yeah,
you know. And really, when I finally grokked it, as they say, when I finally understood it, is when I had to teach it. And I remember the night sitting there going, okay, I got to get this because I've got to teach this tomorrow.
yeah, yeah,
And working through it and working through it. And then it was, and a light bulb went off, and I finally, ah, and it's brilliant, and it's so simple. But it's absolutely brilliant. The
yeah,
problem is that we had to do all kinds of crazy things to models running on sunlight because the more that was coming in, the bigger that you got in these autocatalytic systems, and the bigger it
yeah,
got, the more it can pull in, and it was like, and that's just not the case when you look out there. And it's all about flow limitation. There's only
yeah,
some certain amount that's out there. So it it was a eureka for the whole systems ecology program when everybody finally understood, and all the models all of a sudden, wow, they stopped going crazy, and quite
I
different.
mean, that is such a monumental relationship, and being able to put that into mini models, because you can get that behavior that makes sense. But I empathize with you on the teaching aspect of it. That's when you really, really have to be able to understand it mathematically and philosophically at the same time.
For
And I
sure.
always just think of it as like, well, the storage is just so tiny. That's why it's flow limited. It's really going into a really, really tiny, tiny storage.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
That's how I kind of end up telling the students to think about it.
So
Um,
during that time, I guess during my PhD, I traveled with him around Florida like you did, and my
mhm.
experiences were always that he would sleep,
Yeah, you drive, right?
or a portion of it. Yeah. And I remember this one particular evening, we were coming back from Fort Myers. And I had gone to Fort Myers so many times because of Fort Myers is in Lee County, and that's where all of this early work had done. That I like to come up through the center of the state, up US 27, what I call the backbone of the state of Florida. It's along the sand hills, the sand hill region,
Uh,
right through the center of the state. And especially at night, there's no traffic, and you can just cruise along. So, but we finished with the meeting we had in Fort Myers. He got climbed into the back seat, and I didn't hear from him until I was up close to uh, Sebring, and he
mhm.
kind of popped his head up. Now there were no, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and I think I stopped to get some gas, and he got out and he looked up at the stars and he goes, "Oh, so you come up through the center of the state." Whoa, he's not only can do birds and do wetland ecosystems and do energy and do that, he's also an astronomer and can figure out where he is by looking at the stars.
Wow.
I don't know how he knew. Now maybe he peaked at some point, but I don't remember waking up. But it
Uh-huh.
blew my mind.
Probably look at the cloud covers, telltale signs of who knows his meteorology background.
Or maybe it was the rolling topography, and you figure, well, the only place that
Uh-huh.
could be is in the center of the state. I don't know.
Um, so wow. So he starts the. I was curious. Well, I don't think we talked about this with anybody else, but the center. He starts the Center for Wetlands in the early '70s. Gets the big grant. Does the Cypress projects, and then there's probably other wetland projects that come associated with that, and a lot of students did their dissertations. But eventually, as I think is true throughout his life, he works for a project for maybe about a decade, and then he seems to want to move on for some reason or another, intellectually, whatever. And he kind of starts to hand off the Center for Wetlands to somebody else, supervision, I guess, and then he starts he's transitioning to the Center for Environmental Policy, and I guess more ecological economics and energy. So, what was going on there? I mean, Ronnie Best comes in, and
Yeah.
or he's there, or
So during this time, there's the Cypress Dome project. There were a couple of other projects on wastewater wetland systems around the state. And there was the South Florida project. So there was a lot going on. And he was also the director of the Center for Wetlands, which required signatures and dealing with the day-to-day minutia of running a center. So at one point, and I'm not exactly sure what the politics of that were, whether he was promised money from the hires up to hire an assistant or associate director or what. But anyway, he put the word out on the streets for an associate director, and Ronnie was at Georgia, Ronnie Best, and he applied, and Odum hired him, and he became the the hands-on director. HT was still the director, but Ronnie was
mm-hmm.
associate director. And it was fine. Ronnie brought additional energy and students, and man, the center was just really cranking, and he was bringing in money. By this time now, I'm graduated.
So this is like the early '80s, then, right? At this point,
yeah, I graduated in 1980.
Yeah,
and immediately started writing proposals because I didn't. That was the way. It's the only money. I was on soft money, and Ronnie was writing proposals, and we had money and a lot of phosphate money because of the. There was an excise tax on phosphate that went into a special fund to do research on phosphate, which was set up by the legislature. Big portion or a certain portion of that excise tax on it went to research. So there was a big pot of money down there, and it was about, we were doing research on ecological restoration. Anyway, so Ronnie is the associate director and HT is the director, but then there's a new chair in the Department of Environmental Engineering Sciences who held a grudge against HT. And so there was not good blood between the two of them at all. And at some point, this guy decides to just make Ronnie the director and bring in so there's a water resources research centers that are funded by USGS. It was over in civil engineering, and that guy, no, it wasn't. I'm sorry. It was Jim Heaney, and Jim Heaney left. Jim Heaney was a faculty in environmental engineering sciences. He left the university to take a job out in Colorado, and this the Water Resources Research Center was given to Ronnie as part of the Center for Wetlands. And because of the way he did it, Odum was incensed. It was really no one asked him, no one, and all of a sudden Ronnie's the director and HT is nothing. And so he goes over to Tigard Hall because the money for the Center for Wetlands was money that came out of the administration. It had nothing to do with engineering or environmental engineering.
Mm,
It was money that came from the graduate school for the administrative assistant to run
mhm.
the center.
And some graduate students probably too, maybe.
I don't
No,
think there was any money for graduate. I think it was
just
strictly
administrative.
just a salary line for the person who was doing the administration. HT went over and said, I'm quitting there. I'm going to start a new center. I want half of that money for the Center for Environmental Policy. And nobody wanted to say no to HT. So that's the way that happened. Now, the other thing that during this time, almost all of HT's research and everything else was aimed at environmental policy. I mean, energy and energy analysis, and trying to hook humans and nature together, blah blah blah. And we were writing these proposals to do energy analysis and all kinds of things under the guise of the Center for Wetlands. And there was a mismatch there in terms of here's the center that's sponsoring it, and it's the Center for Wetlands, and and so that was the second reason why it made sense to Odum, I think. And so it was the Center for Environmental Policy was started with half of the money from the full money that was going to the Center for Wetlands, and he used that to pay Joni Breeze's salary or the portion of her salary, and she was
Right.
the administrative assistant for the Center for
His
Environmental.
his long time administrative assistant. But she started there with him at the
She
when he
did
came
not
at the Center
start.
for what?
He had, I think, one or two. I know at least one, and I think two people before Joni started.
Mm.
But Joni was just crazy enough that she could she could handle him.
I always felt like she was so protective of him too. She was always, you know,
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah, suspicious of people coming around sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, good person. Um, so what kind of so this is so you're starting to getting some more international projects. I mean, what's coming in the pipeline to support the Center for Environmental Policy? But it's got the Cousteaus. How's that?
Well, yeah, that's the Cousteau was a big thing. Yeah. Um,
Or
trying
does
to
that
think
date back to the
other ones there were. Um, there were some. I
there's
don't recall off the top of my head, but the big one was I think HT was on sabbatical in New Zealand,
right.
and my phone rings up at the center. I'm still on soft money as far as I remember. And this guy on the other end says, this is Richard Murphy. I'm vice president for science and education at the Cousteau Society. How would you all like to go? Oh, and we've just gotten this big money, a big contract with Ted Turner TV to do a whole series of movies. They didn't call them movies, films on rediscovery of the world. We're calling it rediscovery of the world, and we're going to go around the world and start. And we really want to take some big scale scientists with us. And I was told by Joni Breeze, I think her name is, from HT secretary, that he's out of town and that I should talk to you. And it says, would you all be interested in going on expedition with us? And I thought, who the hell is this? who's yanking my chain? What's going on? So I kept prodding, and I finally began to realize that this guy was for real. He was. And I said, yeah, I think, what are you talking about? And so then he went elaborate a little bit more. He said, we're known for taking scientists along as part of the expedition. It gives us some credibility with the scientific world if we've got real scientists, but all of them are small scale scientists. They're planktologists and they're interested in discovering a new variety of plankton or something. And it furthers their career, but it doesn't do anything for the people that we're trying to help. We leave these places with leaving them with nothing other than the fact that we had been there. And Jean-Michel Cousteau is very much concerned about that and wants to not only do these films and so forth, but to leave some good science that will help people make decisions about better use of their resources and so forth. And we think that this Odum approach, I think you call it or something, would be the kind of science that would benefit these people. Would you like to go? And I said, yeah, for sure.
Not let me check with Odum. Just
yeah.
let's do it.
I said, I'm sure he'll go. So then I learned a little bit more, and Scott Nixon, who was a very, very well respected, very well known marine biologist at Rhode Island, I believe. He was one of HT's first students. He had a student, Jim Kramer, who was at the University of Southern California. And Jim Kramer had a student, Richard Murphy, who's the guy that called me. So there's enough of HT that went from HT to Scott Nixon to Jim Kramer to Richard Murphy that when somebody said, you need a good big scale ecologist, they said HT Odum. It's fascinating to me to think that, he's had that kind of an effect on these people that they call.
Yeah, because this is like decades ago, right? Scott Nixon had probably been a student back in Texas, I'm guessing, maybe, or something. I'm not sure which university.
I think when he was, probably at Chapel Hill, but I don't know that.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, that
turns. Yeah, so you guys are getting ready to travel. So you're going to visit all these exotic places. And the list is pretty long and phenomenal.
It turned into, 6 years of, and I was on soft money. So I wasn't teaching full time. I could leave and travel. So I was in and out traveling a lot. I was teaching. HT wanted me to first to team teach with him, and then eventually he turned over courses. The first thing I think that we team taught was ecological engineering, and I think we did that once, team taught, and then he said you can have it.
Had he taught it before by himself? Is that something he had been doing as part of the Center for Wetlands?
I think, but it was maybe only once or maybe twice. I mean, his course was systems ecology. That and that I used to go to it every year when he taught it, the entire time that I was there, because it was such a pleasure to watch him and listen to him. And no matter how many times I heard it, I'd always, come away with some little new nuance, something that
nothing was ever nothing was static with him.
He was incredible, a delight. It was so much fun to watch him perform, and I think he knew that it was part performance. I really do. And sometimes he would be nervous, and I think it's when he would be nervous is because he was covering new ground, especially in the energy analysis class when he would start. But
I always like to throw out little ideas too. They're just kind of like try to set you off or make you think. Really.
Yeah.
He's like, one day, what was the term he used? He was teaching systems ecology. He's like, well, you're nothing more than a squirrel to an oak tree, or something like that.
Yeah, that I remember that one. That one stuck with me the rest of my life, and I still use it. when he said, that you always have to go to the next larger system if you want to understand something. And if you just look at a squirrel burying nuts, acorns in the forest, you'd go, stupid squirrel. But if you look at the next larger system, he's guaranteeing the long-term survival of all squirrels. He's
Yeah.
planting oak trees. Just blew my mind. It was like, yes, of course.
Yeah, the connectivities, the indirect connections, the next scale shows you.
I wish I wish I would have taped him a bunch, and
Yeah.
jar my memory about the way he pulled things together and the way he lectured. I mean, there was no linearity to it whatsoever. It was, but there was a thread that carried the, whatever it was that he was talking about. And I think you've heard this from other people that we accused him sometimes of just grabbing a whole bunch of at that time there was no PowerPoint, so they were acetate overlays that you put on a overhead projector, and that I have seen him drop them all and then just pick up and keep going. It didn't make any difference what order they were in. He would just talk from the image, and
Yeah.
just
I think he loved the chalk and the diagrams, and he got chalk all over himself. And because these diagrams would just, sketch him out.
and there
But I
was
think he would,
always
he would always come in with the latest literature that he wanted to, and he was trying to diagram somebody else's ideas and to relate, put it into his, which I think systems ecology. He spends a lot of time just diagramming other people's work.
yeah.
It's phenomenal that he can do that. To me,
That's the way I learned the language really well. Was I started every wetland seminar, every Wednesday wetland seminar, I would draw a diagram of whatever the system that the person was speaking on, and then I would give them a copy of it. And I've got this file folder. I mean, it's about that many diagrams.
yeah.
Some of them are, fairly good. A lot of them are just, but I've
Yours always
always,
had that artistic feel to them as well.
yeah,
There's very, especially if you look at, there's a lot of personality in the systems diagram because you can
yeah.
detect, if you looked at enough of them, who drew them.
Yeah. So I sometimes think maybe I should just give them to a draftsman and say, draft all these up and I'll put them somewhere. Right. But
That'd be fun. Where were we?
so in the class, he would always throw out at least 3 dissertation topics in every lecture. As he's going through, he'd say, "Oh, this would be a really good This would be a really good."
Yeah.
Throw them out there, and some of them turned into dissertations, and but everybody was always just, "Oh, wow."
That's how I always felt when you're reading systems ecology. Almost like every paragraph,
Oh yeah,
sometimes a sentence was like an idea for a dissertation. It was just something you could just spend more and more time on.
yeah.
But he touched on so many subjects and showed you how systems are just everywhere. Um, all right, so you travel. So I got to the Gusteau. There's some good stories here. I know.
Well, I'm
So you're
thinking,
going like Papua New Guinea, and you're going to the Gulf of California, and I can't remember where else you went, but
I'd
that's
like to suggest that we stop here for now, if you
sure
if you're amenable to that, and
fine with me. Yeah, works
up
works
to
great.
you. Tell me when, with your schedule, when you want to do it, and we'll do it.
So you do like next. How do you want to publish? You want to publish them separately? You're going to try to thread
No,
them
I'll publish
together?
them separately, part one, part
Yeah.
two.
Um, yeah. I mean, I think next week. What today is Wednesday, so uh, I'm flexible.
Okay, I am
I know
too.
you. Yeah, afternoons seem to work better. I think,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I'm just working on this book, and that's, I get up in the morning and I work on it until 5 o'clock, and I drink a beer and throw the ball for the dog, eat dinner, go to bed, get up and do it again tomorrow.
wow. The
Yeah,
books must be getting close to being finished.
it's
Or
almost
in
done. It's
a solid draft.
everything but the final chapter. And in order to write that final chapter, which is supposed to pull everything together, I'm going back and re-editing all the other chapters. So that way I'm
Yeah, yeah.
familiarizing myself with everything. So
Is it more along the lines of environmental accounting?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, right.
updated.
Just
I
kind
got
of
a lot of really new stuff. I mean, it's
yeah.
been
I mean, that's 20+ years ago.
yeah, it's been a lot of fun for me. I've had a great time. The I'll tell you about it sometime. But anyway,
Yeah, we can pick up on that. So
yeah.
yeah, we'll get some of those custodians. I just remember you chasing the whales. You telling the story in class about swimming. Like the boat was trying to like get you to the whales, and you're just like you hopped out of the boat and just started swimming, and you could tell where the whale was going to be based on where it had been.
Lots of
So
stories.
yeah, we'll have to get that. Yeah, get that one.
Yeah.
Swimming with whales.